For over 2 years, the Donetsk region has been locked in a brutal stalemate, with neither side able to gain decisive ground. But that deadlock may be about to break. Documents leaked to Ukraine's I Want to Live project have exposed devastating losses suffered by Russia's 41st Combined Arms Army. According to these documents, at least 8,625 Russian soldiers are confirmed dead, 10,491 are missing, and 7,846 have deserted as of June 1st, 2025. That's nearly 27,000 personnel lost from just one component of Russia's military, more than the total size of many countries' armed forces. But these are more than just figures in a spreadsheet. They reflect the unraveling of an entire military structure triggered by Putin's failed strategic decisions. Even worse, they point to how Russia's chaotic recruitment efforts are undermining the country's economy and social fabric, potentially crippling the nation permanently. The most heavily hit unit was the 74th Motor Rifle Brigade from Kemerovo Oblast. With 2,479 killed, 2,732 missing, and 2,789 deserters, the brigade has lost more than twice its original force of around 3,500 troops, effectively rendering it destroyed multiple times over. Maintaining even a basic level of functionality must have required complete personnel rotations. Once the initial wave of trained soldiers was wiped out, they were likely replaced by new recruits lured in with favorable contract terms, which we'll explore shortly. To fully grasp the scale of the disaster, it's crucial to consider the 41st Army's area of operation. The leaked data confirms its units were positioned near Pokrovsk in Donetsk Oblast, where they've been slowly eroded by Ukrainian artillery and drone strikes. Pokrovsk isn't just another town. Western analysts label it a strategic gateway to the last heavily fortified Ukrainian positions in Donetsk. The town is at the nexus of key supply highways feeding cities like Chasiv Yar and Kostiantynivka, and it hosts a vital railway hub that supports Ukraine's entire eastern logistics network. If Russia captured Pokrovsk, it could theoretically push deeper into central Ukraine toward Dnipro and Zaporizhzhia. Ukrainian military expert Mikhailo Zherukov warned that losing Pokrovsk could unravel the whole front line. BBC analysts agree Pokrovsk's fall might signal the loss of nearly all of Donetsk. Yet, despite deploying the entire 41st Army and other units, Russia has achieved almost nothing in return, except growing body counts. Though the Ukrainian front line spans over 600 miles, Russia has focused nearly half its offensive power on Pokrovsk. Yet its progress has been measured in football fields, not breakthroughs. Here, Ukraine's defensive strategy shines, forcing Russia to expend enormous resources for one city, weakening their grip on other fronts. The Institute for the Study of War reported that Russian troops attempted to encircle Pokrovsk from the east, south, and west to cut off Ukrainian supplies, but this stretched their forces dangerously thin, leaving them vulnerable and burning through precious human and material resources. And that brings us to the shocking part. The near 27,000 casualties across the 41st Army signal complete systemic collapse. When losses from death, disappearance, and desertion outpace recruitment, an army ceases to be a viable fighting force. That's exactly what we're seeing. Despite Russia's numerical superiority, it's making no real progress. More concerning, the documents reveal that 28% of the 41st Army's deserters were convicts, part of Russia's V companies, units made up of prisoners promised early release in exchange for combat service. This high percentage falls at the upper end of estimates from Ukrainian intelligence, which claims convict representation in Russian frontline units ranges between 5% and 30%. This shows how deeply Russia relies on emptied prisons to staff its war effort. It all began with Wagner Group leader Yevgeny Prigozhin, who started recruiting prisoners in mid-2022. At the time, experts assumed the numbers would remain in the tens of thousands, but by early 2025, Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service estimated that up to 180,000 convicts had been recruited. Russia's prison population dropped from 600,000 to 700,000 in 2014 to 300,000 to 350,000 in 2024. Ukrainian military expert Mikhailo Zherukov warned that losing Pokrovsk could unravel the whole front line. BBC analysts agree. Pokrovsk's fall might signal the loss of nearly all of Donetsk. Yet despite deploying the entire 41st Army and other units, Russia has achieved almost nothing in return, except growing body counts. Though the Ukrainian front line spans over 600 miles, Russia has focused nearly half its offensive power on Pokrovsk. Yet its progress has been measured in football fields, not breakthroughs. Here, Ukraine's defensive strategy shines, forcing Russia to expend enormous resources for one city, weakening their grip on other fronts. The Institute for the Study of War reported that Russian troops attempted to encircle Pokrovsk from the east, south, and west to cut off Ukrainian supplies. But this stretched their forces dangerously thin, leaving them vulnerable and burning through precious human and material resources. And that brings us to the shocking part. The near 27,000 casualties across the 41st Army signal complete systemic collapse. When losses from death, disappearance, and desertion outpace recruitment, an army ceases to be a viable fighting force. That's exactly what we're seeing. Despite Russia's numerical superiority, it's making no real progress. More concerning, the documents reveal that 28% of the 41st Army's deserters were convicts, part of Russia's V companies, units made up of prisoners promised early release in exchange for combat service. This high percentage falls at the upper end of estimates from Ukrainian intelligence, which claims convict representation in Russian frontline units ranges between 5% and 30%. This shows how deeply Russia relies on emptied prisons to staff its war effort. It all began with Wagner Group leader Yevgeny Prigozhin, who started recruiting prisoners in mid-2022. At the time, experts assumed the numbers would remain in the tens of thousands. But by early 2025, Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service estimated that up to 180,000 convicts had been recruited. Russia's prison population dropped from 600,000 to 700,000 in 2014 to 300,000 to 350,000 in 2024. Russian dissident Vladimir Osechkin, citing sources within the Federal Penitentiary Service, claimed that over 100,000 inmates had been offered pardons to fight, with more than 1,000 dying in Ukraine every week. Under Wagner's model, those who survived 6 months at the front were granted pardons. But surviving that period proved far harder than expected. US intelligence estimated that by May 2023, Wagner had lost 10,000 fighters and wounded 40,000 since December 2022, 90% of them convicts. The use of convicts poses challenges beyond military efficiency. These prisoners are deployed in expendable human wave assaults meant to exhaust Ukrainian defenses before professionals move in, a tactic obsolete since World War I. Worse, the UN has documented abuse, threats, and even executions of recruits trying to escape, with others injured as public warnings, and thousands of these criminals are now being released back into Russian society, raising safety concerns. The leaked files also show 2,200 convict deserters from the 41st Army alone are roaming freely in Russia, an obvious recipe for internal instability. Yet these grim figures underscore Ukraine's greatest weapon, psychological warfare. The leaked documents didn't come from battlefield intelligence. They were supplied by Russian soldiers themselves, disillusioned with their own army's collapse. They were handed over to Ukraine's I Want to Live project, an innovative program launched in September 2022 by Ukraine's defense intelligence. This 24/7 hotline, telegram bot, and website offers Russian soldiers surrender instructions, legal help, and asylum information. But its power lies in targeting the heart of Putin's strategy, asking men to die for a cause while treating them as expendable. The project has recorded over 48 million visits to its site, 46 million from inside Russia, despite being blocked days after launch. Over 26,000 Russians have contacted the hotline, with 220 confirmed surrenders and 1,000 cases pending by late 2024. It speaks directly to Russia's most vulnerable fighters, many from poor or marginalized backgrounds, offering support tailored to conscripts, civilians forced to fight, and disillusioned career soldiers. This initiative generates a feedback loop. Word spreads through communities and army units, revealing that surrender is not only possible, it's preferable. And this undermines Russia's illusion of nationwide support for the war. The program capitalizes on the ethnic and class divisions within the Russian army. Many callers are ethnic minorities who feel exploited while Moscow's elite stays protected, a critical vulnerability in Kremlin propaganda. Let's revisit the desertion numbers. The 28% of deserters from V companies were men who took the first chance to flee a system that treated them as disposable. The fact that officers allowed these documents to reach Ukraine reveals their own awareness of the growing danger convicts pose, both within the ranks and back home. Yet Russia's recruitment crisis isn't just about prisons. It's also about Putin offering huge financial incentives to attract soldiers, so large they distort the economy. A soldier from Moscow can now earn up to 7.1 million rubles per year, around $82,000, combining a 5.2 million ruble salary and 1.9 million signing bonus. That's nearly 3/4 of Putin's own 2021 income. In poorer regions, monthly salaries of 200,000 rubles are 2.4 times the national average, and the signing bonus alone equals 22 times the minimum wage. But even these incentives don't suffice. Since the war began, at least 51 regions have raised contract bonuses, an unmistakable sign of a manpower crisis. Why compete for recruits with money if people are already volunteering? The reason is dire. These financial pressures are triggering three major economic catastrophes. First, Russia's economy is being hollowed out by military spending. 40% of the national budget now goes to defense, starving sectors like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Even the military-industrial sector is under strain, being asked to produce more with fewer resources, untrained workers, and unrealistic timelines, leading to cut corners and inferior weapons. Russian economist Sergei Guriev describes two parallel economies, the state-backed military sector, which appears to grow, and the civilian one, crippled by inflation and unemployment. Life for most Russians deteriorates, except in defense industries. Second, Russia is facing a demographic collapse. With unemployment falling to historic lows, the military, factories, and civilian economy are all competing for the same shrinking workforce. About 700,000 Russians are on the front, with the war consuming 10,000 to 30,000 workers monthly. That's 0.5% of the labor force lost every month. Fewer babies are being born, only 1.2 million in 1999 versus 2.5 million in 1985. Combine this with over 600,000 working-age Russians fleeing since 2022, and the situation becomes critical. Russia may be hoping to replenish its population by seizing Ukraine's 29 million people, assuming they stay and survive. But that assumes victory without further major losses, which seems unlikely. Third, the recruitment system is gutting Russia's poorest regions while sparing its political and economic centers. It's a form of human extraction, targeting ethnic minorities and rural populations while shielding Moscow and St. Petersburg. A 2023 BBC report showed that 6 of the 10 regions with the highest casualties were in Siberia and the Far East. Men from Buryatia were 75 times more likely to die than those from Moscow. This isn't by accident, it's policy. High regional unemployment makes military pay attractive, but it creates a vicious cycle. Remote areas with less media and resistance are drained of their young men. These men often spend their earnings on luxuries or gambling, and propaganda showcases their wealth to boost support for the war. But that's offset by their high fatality rate. Russia's military now consists mainly of a handful of seasoned officers and fresh recruits lured by cash. Those from poor regions die in greater numbers, and if injured, they receive reduced payouts. Entire ethnic communities are collapsing demographically, with unsustainable birth rates and shrinking populations. This deepens marginalization and raises ethnic tensions inside the military, where bullying and racial hostility have been reported. Russia is now weakening the very regions that could resist Moscow in the future. This might trigger separatist movements or regional collapse, with provinces dependent on aid that will never arrive. All of this might have made short-term sense if Russia had won quickly. When the invasion began in February 2022, the plan was a swift, overwhelming victory, before the costs became unbearable. The private sector cannot sustain this system. It's competing with military recruitment and arms production over the same pool of men in already deprived regions. Meanwhile, Moscow and St. Petersburg remain untouched. They house the politically vital population, isolated from the true cost of war. This imbalance is dangerous. Putin doesn't treat this war as existential. Otherwise, universal conscription would have been enacted long ago, but that would risk his hold on power. Now, he must convince Russians the war is worth it while protecting the people who keep him in office. If the military continues to lose men without expanding recruitment to central Russia, it risks becoming a force made up entirely of minorities and rural poor. At that point, a revolt becomes possible. A military revolt echoing the fall of Imperial Russia. The collapse of the 41st Army isn't just a battlefield failure. It's a symptom of Russia's broader decay. A regime that chose war over reform, fiction over truth, and short-term gains over survival. And these leaked reports show that rot growing from the inside, one death at a time.